Hello, everyone. My name is Marius Moscovici, and I'm the founder and CEO of Metric Insights. Welcome to our webinar today, Disruptive Data Governance That Doesn't Suck. I am joined today by Laura Madsen, who is the author of this wonderful book, Disrupting Data Governance, A Call to Action. She's also a principal in the consulting firm Via Gurus. Laura has been around the business intelligence space, helping companies large and small with various aspects of business intelligence and governance for over 20 years. I'm really delighted to have her join us today. If you have not read her book, highly recommend it. It is a really fresh take on data governance. She has this wonderful sense of humor that comes across in the writing. Data governance oftentimes can be a little bit of a dull topic, and her book is anything but dull. It is really a lovely read. We will be providing a one copy of a book as a raffle winner to everyone who attended this, to one person who attended this this webinar. If you're not the lucky winner, then I strongly recommend that you go pick up a copy and check it out yourself. And with that, I would like to let me introduce Laura, and we'll kind of jump in. We're going to be from as far as the webinar, the agenda is Laura is going to give an overview of disruptive data governance. And what's involved in that, and give some practical guide for how to really make data governance effective. And then I will provide some specific examples, again, sort of building off of some ideas that she presents, things that you can take as actionable ideas, things you can apply within your environment as takeaways. And then we'll open it up for discussion and Q&A. So there is a Q&A area in the webinar, so go ahead and Zoom and drop your questions as you think of them. And when we get to the end of the presentation, we'll go through those and use those as the basis of our discussion. So with that, Laura, please take it away.
Well, hello, everyone. Assuming you can all hear me, or at least the people that can tell me that you can hear me, I have to say that I was so excited about the title, Disruptive Data Governance That Doesn't Suck, because it makes me smile. And I, particularly with this topic, right? If you've been in this space for a period of time, this is probably one of the most sort of potentially uninteresting, boring topics that there are in data as an industry as a whole. And that's been one of the challenges for those folks that live and breathe in this space, right? Is just how do we communicate and disrupt and get excited about data governance when it just almost in its name is sort of like blah. So one of the things I open the book with is this, like, I hate data governance. Like, I kind of hate it, right? I mean, I can't tell you that I, in the beginning, really rallied around this idea of being super excited about data governance, writing about data governance. It certainly wasn't my original intention. But one of the things I noted as I sort of took a lay of the land of our data industry, I was trying to figure out what things were preventing us from being really successful sharing insights across organizations. And I've been on the other side of the data industry table for most of my career. In other words, I led a lot of data teams and business intelligence teams, analytic teams, whatever you want to call them, over the years. And I've been a consultant for less time than that. And I can tell you that in almost every instance, data governance was the thing that just felt like it in general held me back. And I couldn't get to the things that I really needed to get to in terms of sharing insights across the organization. So when I took that lay of the land and realized the data governance was kind of that thing, I can tell you that I was very hesitant to write this book initially, but the thing that really got me going was this idea of disrupting data governance, because I do like to disrupt things. I enjoy chaos a great deal, and when things aren't working, I love to tear them apart and blow them up and try over again. So despite my hesitancy, that's how the book Disrupting Data Governance came about. And one of the first things that kind of became my rallying cry for disrupting data governance was I Googled it, and I came back with like a two-paragraph definition of data governance. It was long. It described everything and nothing at the same time. It had zero operational value. And, you know, even though I had been working in the space for 20 years, I couldn't tell you what that meant. And so, you know, for me, it became less about how do you put a bunch of words to describe data governance to how can I operationalize data governance in our organizations? And that's where I came up with sort of these 4 primary categories. I will say that since then, since I Googled the definition of data governance all those couple of years ago now, there have been better definitions that have come about. And I think Gartner has done a very good job describing data governance, and I won't go into it here, but it focuses on much more of the usage of the asset and all of those things. But I still really like this operational definition of data governance, and it comes down to these 4 things: usage, quality, lineage, and protection. So the first thing is, and I say this a lot and I get excited about it, and I know that oftentimes in webinars excitement doesn't come across, so let me do my best. If we're not helping people use the data, what the hell are we doing? Like, what are we doing? And by the way, that's not just in data governance, right? I see it across a lot of data programs. And there's lots of reasons why. And in some, you know, there's some impact in different industries. It makes it harder to share data. But quite literally, if you aren't constructing your data ecosystem around this idea of using the asset, what are you doing? And for a long time, governance was almost the antithesis of usage. It was often the thing that we prevented people from using data by carrying that banner of I'm governing my data. And, you know, I just really feel like that's the wrong approach for lots of reasons. But one of the primary reasons is your data program won't exist if people don't use the data, because they're not going to continue to invest in it. And I've seen this sort of play out in a number of ways over the years. So really the first and foremost thing that we have to focus on from a data governance perspective is we have to allow usage of that data, but we have to recognize, and of course we all do recognize, that there are limitations around how we allow people to use data, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The second thing from an operational definition is it has to improve the quality. And I think nobody really argues this point. Everybody talks about data quality, and you know, I would say that there's no data governance without data quality. And people kind of get nervous when I say stuff like that. But I also would say that there is no data quality without data governance. And you know, interesting, I've gotten a lot of sort of heat about disrupting data governance over the past couple of years. And there's a couple of areas that people get really nervous about, but that happens to be one of the big ones, is, you know, tying so tightly governance to quality and quality to governance. And I'm not really sure why people get so uptight about it, but I think about data quality as sort of these leading indicators of how effective your governance is. And, you know, record counts is not, to me, data quality. That's just like, you know, the cost of doing business. So we really have to make sure that however we operationally define data governance, not only are we increasing usage, but we have to improve quality. I also happen to believe that if you increase your usage, your quality is going to go up. And I think a lot of people get nervous because as you're letting your data free and you're getting it out there, people are going to do, and I use this air quotes, right? Dumb stuff with the data, right? A great example, and I've seen too many examples to count, but the one that, you know, most of us have seen is, you know, making poor or wrong decisions, or just misinterpreting, or, you know, summing averages kind of stuff. And the thing is about any of this is we've got to increase the muscle memory of our organization to use data to become data driven. You know, for those of us that are in the industry, we've been around this stuff for so long, it sort of becomes second nature. But if your job isn't data and you have to look at this report and figure out what that means, you know, that's going to take some effort and some exercise, essentially. And creating this organizational memory or muscle memory around using information to make decisions will increase the value and the quality of your data in the long run. But in the short run, it's going to be kind of painful. But I do believe that if you take those two things together, as you increase usage, as you increase people asking tough questions, as you increase your end users' ability to understand what that data is and what it means, as you increase the conversations that happen and you start to understand what they see and why it's important and what you're doing and why that's important, all of those things are just going to be fuel for a higher quality product. This relates directly to Lineage. So for, a really long time in data as a whole, one of the challenges is, as an end user, you enter data into the front end system like an ERP or something like that. I've worked in healthcare a long time, so you enter data into an electronic health record. And the next time you see it in a dashboard or a report or something like that. And the gap between those two as an end user is giant. It's like a chasm of a gap between what they thought they entered, or oftentimes what they do enter, and the back end and how, finalized, aggregated, pristine it is. And for a really long time, even those of us in the data industry, if somebody came to us and said, oh, this report's wrong, right? We would have a difficult time tracing back or doing that regression test against that report that we created. So Lineage, from that front end system to the completed sort of end point of a dashboard or a report, is incredibly important because it gives your data team the answers to, why is this report wrong? At least you can trace it. It doesn't take you 2 or 3 weeks to do that. But it also increases the trust factor of your end users when they come to you and they express some concerns and you're like, well, I don't know. And it takes you 2 weeks to figure it out. They're like, well, how can they not know? They're the ones that produced it. So we really have to, I'm not on that slide yet.
Sorry about that, Laura.
It's like, why is she taking so long on this one slide?
I'm not rushing you. Sorry, I just hit one button.
So from a Lineage perspective, it really is giving yourself the understanding of where that data comes from, but it really is a lot more about that communication point and being able to build that trust and help them to understand where that data travels to and from. And it also helps a lot in the audit requirement for a lot of what is traditionally a core of data governance, which is protection of the data. So when we talk about protection of the data, for time in memoriam, really, as long as data governance has been around, that's been at the core of what data governance has meant. And in the beginning, in the late 90s, and I was around then building data warehouses and analytic programs. Data governance was it. We didn't have CISOs or an information security department. If you were building the data warehouse, it was your accountability to protect that as an asset. And fast forward, of course, all those years, and there are lots of people, but there are entire programs, degree programs where you focus exclusively on this. It's an entire industry, and folks, I'm not in that industry, right? Don't ask me to be fully accountable to protect your data. You wouldn't ask me to do the things I used to do in the, at the back half of the 90s. Why would you ask me to do it now? Why would we use the same systems, the same methodologies, the same software we did back then? So much has changed in that space, and we really need to make sure that the people that are fully trained and know what they're doing in that from protection of data are accountable for that protection of the data. It doesn't mean that we don't have accountability or some responsibility in that space. Of course we do. We are still the stewards of that asset, but we shouldn't be dictating how all that happens. We are just there to support our privacy, security, risk, and compliance teams to ensure that we execute against their policies. But if you are a data governance function that still writes policies, that ain't your job, folks. If you really, really like it, then maybe there's somebody in your privacy, security, risk, and compliance that you can ask about a job. But I firmly believe that this is no longer our responsibility, or accountability, I should say. But we do have to create a happy alliance with with that team, because it is still our responsibility at the end of the day to protect that asset. So we shouldn't be writing policies and procedures, but we do have to follow a lot of those standards to ensure that we're doing the right things when it comes to protection of that data. Now you can change the slide. I have my notes down here. to change my notes when it says paintbrushes on the screen. So now we all know that we're ready to go on to the next screen. So here's the thing, regardless to how you define it, right? Pretty words like Gartner put together, operational definition where you have categories, which by the way, those categories work really well when you start looking at agile constructs for implementing data governance, but that's not what we're talking about today. But one of the things that we all have to sort of recognize is that regardless to the words that we use, the operational definition that we use, in order for data governance to be effective, it has to be pervasive, right? It is not something that can just live in a bubble or in a team or a department. It really has to be responsive and resilient to operate at the speed of business. And you know, one of the things that I really want to make sure that is clear as we start to think about disrupting data governance in that way and trying to make it pervasive is we're building that organizational memory and creating that capability for lots of people to ask really important questions about the data and not hero worship of our analysts or that kind of a thing. And I see this in so many organizations when they start to build out capabilities in this space. And really the only way to create these really pervasive data governance and make sure that it is effective and responsive and resilient over time, because what often happens, right, is you have this person and they know where all of your data bodies are buried, and then they leave the organization because the pressure gets too much and then everything falls apart. So this is where it's more than just the metrics of what a data governance is. It's more than just those 4 categories. There's kind of some magic in increasing the usage and creating that organizational memory and getting people to ask really tough questions about what the data is. But it's also very much about making sure that you're clear about what data governance is. So it is about using the data. It is about data quality. It is about making sure that you have the lineage of that data. It is about protecting the data, but also very clear about what data governance is not. It cannot be the other bucket for your data programs. It cannot be a training mechanism like, oh, well, they don't understand, so we're just going to train them some more, right? There's so many things that data governance sort of accidentally became because there was no other mechanism to do it. So in order to make this really pervasive across your organization, be crystal clear about what it is, which those 4 categories help you with, but also be extremely clear about what it is not, and mercilessly focus on those, right? Build that large in-house group of people that are using the data and that are willing to have tough conversations. And we used to call them data stewards. We can argue about what we call them, but that's kind of where you start, how you increase the usage. It really comes down to the people that use that data and how they use it and what the kind of questions that they ask. And then start creating sort of a punch list, right, of all the things that are important to your data governance effort. If you really focus on a couple of things and you have that network and they're asking really great questions, then you create a punch list of things that you're going to start to work on. All right. Next slide, please. There's all kind of memes about that whole next slide thing. I should come up with a clever way of saying next slide, please. All right, so 3 things. Here's 3 things I really want you to think about as you start to noodle on disrupting data governance, because there is a fine line between disrupting and destructive, as I've been recently reminded. So number 1, I really want you to talk to your privacy, security, risk, and compliance teams and create your happy alliance. It's the first step for lots of reasons. It's whatever analogy you want to use, the longest runway, the longest pole in the tent or whatever, but it's the thing that takes the time. It's also the thing that if you don't do well, it'll really make the foundation pretty sketchy from a data governance perspective. So make sure you work with them. If they're writing policies, if they're writing procedures, make sure you understand what your accountability is in executing against those policies and procedures. There's just too much riding on that. Number 2, I like this idea of adapting to an ambassadorship-like function of protection and promotion of your data. It is literally the definition of ambassador, to protect and promote. And you have to balance both of those things. And that's where you start to look at creating a network in your organization of people that know and understand sort of intuitively how to balance those things. They want to use the data, they want to become more data driven, they're really making actionable decisions based off of that, but they're also willing to ask the tough questions, push back when they don't think quality is where it should be, and all of those things. So adapt to that ambassadorship-like function for protection and promotion of your data. And then finally, of course, we're all on a webinar hosted by Metric Insights. So I really, one of the things that I liked about Metric Insights is this, they've really underlined this pervasive, responsive, and resilient approach to data governance. And I think that's one area that all of us can agree on, whether you want to agree on disrupting or not. In order to get this to work, you have to make sure that it is pervasive, responsive, and resilient. That's all I got.
Thank you, Laura. So I'm going to sort of build on what Laura said here and give you a few examples of ways in which to put this into action. And here you might see some examples of some of our product, but the focus of this webinar really isn't about Metric Insights per se. What we're interested in is really taking these ideas that Laura's put forth and really understanding a little more about, how do you put some of this into action? What are some examples? And then especially as it relate more to perhaps the BI governance aspect of the organization. And then I think after this my part of the presentation, we'll do some general Q&A and discussion. So first of all, I want to sort of stress one thing that I've seen as one of the biggest issues with governance in general, and that is that organizations invariably sort of take this kind of one-size-fits-all approach that is fundamentally flawed, and data governance sucks because of this in many case situations. And what do I mean by that? Well, governance, as Laura said at the beginning, is something that really no one loves to do. Very few of us maybe are very interested in that, but largely within an organization, people don't want to do things like data classification and quality, and these are not the sexy parts of their job, the things that they're really excited about, right? They're excited about doing analysis or viewing analysis or making decisions off of the data. So you kind of, it takes on this characteristic of like something that you have to do, kind of like, personally, for me, it's like going shopping for clothes, right? I would do almost anything other than go shopping for clothes. I hate that, right? So, but you have to do it because you've got to wear something, right? So it kind of falls into that. And so you say, well, something people don't really want to do, but yet we know we have to do it. There are compliance requirements. There are requirements within the organization. We know if we don't have governance, there are going to be all kinds of issues with poor use of data, with mistakes that get made. So it has to be done. So then what happens is you kind of hit this least common denominator approach. We say, well, what's the least amount of governance that we can do so that we can be compliant with our overall regulatory governance practices, and that people are going to be willing to buy into actually adopting, right? And that becomes the baseline, and then people kind of go against that, and that's fundamentally a flawed approach. We'd be equivalent to kind of having a clothing store and saying, well, I'm just going to give everybody walking in the door the average size suit that I have because I don't want to take up their time measuring them carefully, right? Everyone's going to come out looking like this person over here, right? So don't do that. Instead, what, from a practical perspective, what we recommend is that you take a content classification grid. So you look at the things that you want to govern and you say, well, where do they fall in? And this is through the lens of a sort of BI assets, but I think a similar kind of approach can be taken to the data assets as well. You can say, well, first of all, what is the business impact around this particular asset? Is it something that if there's a problem with underlying information or it's presented that it's going to have fairly small impact, or is this something that is being consumed by the board or the executives in your organization, or is consumed in making some critical decision making that is going to have massive impact in your organization? So getting it right is just a mission critical kind of priority. So that's one axis. And then the other axis you can think about is, what's the audience size for this information? Is this going to a really small part of the organization or is it really being broadly consumed? right? And if you start looking at those at any given asset and you say, well, where does it fit? You know, where in the sizing chart, you may find that different people need to be involved in the governance practice around that. So, for example, let's imagine you have a dashboard or report that you're trying to govern, and it's something with a small impact, and it only has a small audience size. You know, maybe it's something that your network engineer is using to be able to look and see how the performance is on their internal network. So it's not so there it might be a BI analyst alone that can govern that content, and they can ensure that the proper data governance practices are applied to that BI asset. On the other hand, maybe there's something that has maybe broader distribution that is going to a larger group of users, and it has significant impact. It's being used by your sales team to figure out how they're doing relative to their targets. And so, you know, you don't want to get that wrong, because that's going to have massive negative impact on morale and so forth. Well, you want to involve multiple parties in. It should be a more involved process. It should probably involve BI analysts together with the business owner in concert, making the decisions and governing that content. And then there's potentially scenarios where you have something with large impact, and both from an audience size and a business impact perspective. And there, a data steward should be involved as well, because you need to have multiple parties, each with their areas of expertise, all collaborating together on the end-to-end governance of the analytic and the underlying data that's being sent as part of that. And you can imagine, as you think through the different assets in your organization and the classification for those, you can identify particular places on this grid that you could place them. And then based on that, you can think about the different roles in your organization that are involved in governance and how those roles can actually be applied towards effective governance of that type of asset based on this classification. Additionally, kind of another dimension, another slice of this is you want to think about what are all the steps that you want to follow in publishing new analytics to make sure that a proper governance process has been applied. So, Laura talked about data quality. How do we make sure that we know the data quality is there? Maybe you've got some data classification information, so that anytime you're publishing a new dashboard, you want to make sure that whether it's sensitive or contains PII data, all of that has to be implemented. You want to have standardized documentation that you apply in place, as an example. So release notes, things of that nature. Glossary terms, so what does this represent? What are the enterprise KPIs that are being held in this particular asset that's being published? As well as certification. Is this a gold level certified content? Is it uncertified because it hasn't gone through the vetting process? So going through that as an example, and perhaps you have these 5 things that you want to look at every time you go through a publishing of a dashboard. Well, depending upon what kind of asset you have, you're going to have different parties involved in this. So maybe on one of those assets, it's a single party certification model. An analyst, the BI analyst, can do all parts of this. They can make sure that the data is good. They can make sure that the documentation is there and so forth, all the way through the certification. Things that require 2-party certification, you will have to split out those responsibilities. So the tagging to glossary terms, well, that might go to the business owner. Whereas the certified content, perhaps the business owner should validate that as well, while the BI analyst does the front end of the process. And then in the most involved data governance practices, those where people are going to need to do a lot of things to make sure that this is absolutely spot on right. In those scenarios, you've got different parties, and again, you'll split that up so that perhaps you have the data steward responsible for the data quality and the classification and all the earlier stage pipelining aspects, whereas the analyst is just responsible for making sure, yes, this is correctly documented, and the business owner is certifying and ensuring that the right business glossary terms are associated. So again, there's not a one-size-fits-all here as well. It has to be tailored to your organization, but the idea being, thoughtfully consider how you want to move things through the different stages. What are the things that are required for certification, and then making sure that the right party is involved in that process, depending upon what kind of asset it is in your certification. So, and then from a pervasiveness perspective, right? So if we go back to kind of what Laura said about, it's really important to make data governance pervasive. If you're going to be pervasive about it, it needs to extend beyond the analyst. It has to extend all the way to the business user. And really, it means data governance and the whole idea of getting this information means different things to different constituents in your organization, right? So for example, to a business user, governance is all about understanding, for example, what is it that I'm looking at, right? So when I'm looking at this Tableau dashboard, what are the enterprise KPIs that are part of that? What are the dimensions that are part of that? And then being able to quickly discover and understand what is the definition of that. So when I look at the sales KPI, what does it mean? Who owns it? Who is the data steward that's responsible for it? And can I quickly get to other assets that contain this information? So this promotes not only data literacy, but proper governance so that I have the right interpretation of the data. I'm looking at, if I look at sales or churn or any key term, I know when I'm looking at that information, what does it really mean and how I should use it. So that's sort of the consumer perspective into governance. The publisher is often looking at governance from a totally different lens. They're looking at more things along the lines of what Laura mentioned, like Lineage, right? So you want to make access to Lineage pervasive for that consumer, that publisher, right? So they can come in and say, oh, I'm sending this content out to my users. Well, where does this content come from? Oh, this image comes from a Tableau dashboard, and that Tableau dashboard comes from the Snowflake view, which is based on the following different tables. And here's how all my data comes together to be able to generate this analytic that then is delivered to my business. And this information gives you that impact analysis, capability to impact analysis, but also gives you the context so that I, as an information publisher, perhaps I'm thinking of doing creating something new to answer a question that was being asked of me. I can go and I can determine, does this analytic that already exists, that was created by someone else, does that actually answer the question based on where it's coming from, the data that it's using, and so forth. So different audiences, very different kind of lens for how to make the governance information pervasive to users. Another aspect of it, again, if you're going to make it pervasive, then you need to take and make sure that there's a persona-based application of governance all the way out to the UI area, all the way out to where people are consuming content. So for example, let's imagine that you've got a classification and you say, well, information is either internal, confidential, restricted, or public. Well, you want to make sure that you have the ability to say, well, what does that mean from a consumption model? It should mean that if I'm a regular user and I'm looking at content that is flagged to be confidential, or let's say it contains PII data and it's been flagged in that way, then I cannot download it. But if I'm the HR person who's responsible for working with that dashboard and I'm in a restricted status, then I should be able to download it. So the controlling, printing, downloading, the interaction with that data in a way that is nuanced, that is not a one-size-fits-all, but rather set based on the role of the user. That's another critical way in order to make it possible for the data governance practice to translate into something that is truly pervasive within an organization. Another aspect of it, we talked about resiliency, right? And Laura mentioned that as one of the key pillars. How do you make sure your data governance is resilient? And one of the key aspects of this is that resiliency is all about handling changes, right? So when you have content and you've put it out there and it is certified, well, now you need to have a process by which it can undergo changes, because perhaps there are things that happen to decertified, or perhaps it needs to be reconsidered for recertification after a time. So your governance practices need to say, well, what are the things that trigger the recertification? Is it a calendar-based thing? If this is valid and certified and really good now, how long is it before it needs to be reevaluated for certification, or that it becomes automatically decertified? So I'll give you an example. There's some things that get decertified automatically, like financial reports, right? A monthly close happens at the beginning of the month. That data is decertified. The analytics behind that should be set with decertified status until the financial team has fully certified and performed the close and verified everything. And then that analytic can show certified status again. So that's an example. And some of other things might just go through a period of time where you will, after a year or 6 months, you just bring that up back for review. And you say, well, is this something that I need to take a look at and say, well, do these rules that we use to compute the sales attainment or churn, are these still valid in these analytics? And then evaluate them and then recertify as part of that. So again, making sure things go into the right process. And then also understanding that from a resiliency perspective, if the analytic itself or the underlying data changes, there has to be a process by which you automatically decertify or bring things into a review process. So, and depending upon the impact of that change. right? So if you've gone in and you've changed the fundamental definition of a metric in a table or an analytic, you want to have a mechanism by which that will bubble up and automatically decertify the dashboards that use that, so until that has been taken into account, and that's bubbled all the way through. On the other hand, maybe a low risk change, somebody changing a description, that might be more suitable for just a notification to say, well, here you're the owner of this. Heads up, there's been a change in the definition. Should we change the certification status, or is it okay? So again, not a one size fits all, but rather a more nuanced approach, but that takes into effect the fact that resiliency means that you need to know about the changes and then properly take them into account. Also, part of resiliency is handling failure, right? So all of us have scenarios where something happens in the data pipelining and there's a quality issue. And as Laura mentioned, it's not just about row counts. It could be about, on fundamental KPIs and changes in there, but something happens where something looks peculiar. Normally this table has 10,000 rows and today it has 8,500, or normally this KPI trends between a very narrow band and today it's way off of that, right? So what do you do about that? How do you make sure that the data quality actually translates into something that users can get value out of? Well, it needs to basically take that data quality alert, or that check that you have in place, needs to be propagated all the way to the user, right? So as a user of a particular dashboard, I should be able to come in and say, oh, there is a problem with the data issue today, and somebody's looking into it, and it should be the system telling the user, telling the business user that there is an issue with the data, and not the business user having to call up IT or let the data governance team or let somebody know that there's a problem, right? So making sure that you have systems that are proactive and you've built in sort of these checks, especially around the most critical analytics, that tell you where there are issues with the data, absolutely critical to making sure that you have a truly resilient system. So then the third part of it, the ability to be responsive, right? And Laura, I think that one of the things I loved about sort of Laura's book and the one of the key points that she said is that there's this amazing relationship that effective governance should promote higher usage, higher engagement, right? And the reality is that none of us, when we're working in any kind of a real environment, know exactly when we're making a change, if that particular change or that thing that we did is going to promote usage or not, right? It's such a complex ecosystem. There's so many things going on that you need to be able to have a feedback loop in place whereby you're constantly measuring, are you making changes that are boosting engagement? Are you increasing usage and adoption, or are you not doing that? And so that means having some process in place to regularly measure what is the engagement with the content that you've already published. And then also means understanding what are people looking for that they're not able to find, whether that's the data level with search or at the analytics level search. If people are constantly looking for something and they're never finding the right analytic for a particular term, well, maybe that's a term that needs to be mapped to an existing analytic better. Or maybe that represents something and we need to develop an analysis on to really boost engagement. So using governance more broadly than just that classic sense of restriction of access or ensuring that people don't get into things that they shouldn't. Instead, having this broader approach where you say, how do I use governance to boost engagement, to make sure that I'm measuring the right things and I'm using those measurements and feeding that back to the analysts that can make the right decisions in order to promote increased usage over time. So that's very important. Secondarily, if you've got all these practices, so you've come up with, okay, now here's how we're going to use our sensitive data. These are the things people should do. They should make sure they don't email it outside the organization. Here's how they should share it or not share it. Here's the practices that we should follow. If those things are just in a wiki somewhere or in SharePoint somewhere, that's going to do you no good, right? So making sure that the governance practices are responsive and pervasive means you need to make sure that they are delivered directly to the end user. The end user should be able to say, well, if they're going to be consuming content that is sensitive for the first time, they should be at that point in time prompted to be notified, hey, confirm that you understand that these are the usage guidelines around that. So again, taking those governance practices from the data all the way to the analytic and making sure that the users are interacting in the experience where they're confirming their understanding and their compliance with those practices. And those things are audited from a compliance perspective as an organization. And then finally, if you're going to be responsive in the way that you are interacting with your governing your information, and you're going to boost usage. That means that while you are guarded around the data and security around the data, you need to be open to having people discover content that they might not be aware of, and they might not be given access to explicitly. So there's often a process by which anytime a new report or dashboard or analytic is created, that access is given to a particular group of individuals for that. And what happens is over time, there's drift, and maybe that's no longer the right team, or maybe there's somebody that wasn't considered in the original group because they work with an adjacent team, and they could actually use that analytic. They could drive better decision making. That could increase usage of that analytic. Well, the systems that you put in place from a governance perspective need to allow that discoverability to take place. We need to allow for that user who's coming in that is searching for something to discover that, hey, a peer in another organization's created this, or there's another visualization, and they don't have access to it, and that's okay, but they don't see any of the information, right? They can't get to it, but they know that it's there, and they have enough of an idea of the metadata around that, such that they can click on it, request access, and then that access request goes through the proper channels to get them access to that content. And that promotes pervasiveness of the analytic, it promotes high usage, and it creates a much more responsive governance frame. So kind of to just sum up the way that we think of how to really transform data governance in a way that I think it's very compatible with sort of some of the vision that Laura laid out, is that oftentimes today data governance is one of those things that just sits in a silo, right? You go through all this effort, oftentimes maybe even get data governance tools in your organization like Elation or Calibra or homegrown tools that are built. There are all kinds of investments are made in technology to do things like improve quality and get certification in place and understand lineage and capture usage stats, and you bring all this information in from ETL tools and data sources, and all that's great. But what happens is that information is locked away, and it's available only to a set of data governance folks and maybe some analysts that remember and know to go into those tools to access them. And that is a fundamental sort of flaw, because your data governance, for it to be effective, it needs to be free. It needs to be out there where it's broadly consumable, pervasive throughout the entire organization, and it needs to be linked up with the same platforms that you use to drive engagement. Those BI tools, the portals, places where people request access and collaborate and get content distributed, those systems need to integrate and pull metadata from the governance tools that you have in place, whether those tools are spreadsheets or more advanced governance technologies, and they need to be able to present that information to users in a nuanced way, in a persona-driven way, in a way that supports governance workflow, such that then instead of just having a handful of analysts benefit from the governance work that you're doing, they should be broadly, all information consumers should benefit from it. So that's the one thing I would want to leave you with. So with that, let's move to the Q&A area. So Laura, if you want to jump back onto video, and let's see what we have from the questions. So first question is, how do you improve credibility, respect for data governance, as credibility improves adoption and use? So Laura, I think you probably have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, credibility is always the tough one, right? So how do you improve credibility, respect for data governance as credibility improves adoption/use? I'm not exactly sure what we're trying to get at there, but what I can tell you for sure is, and this is true across a lot of engagement-like functions for data as a whole, governance being one of them, if you choose to do it this way. But as you start to communicate, as you increase transparency, as you encourage people to ask the difficult questions, your credibility and trust will increase. So for a long time in the data space, particularly BI teams and analytic teams, we had this perspective of protecting people from the things that they couldn't possibly understand. And what we did is we created our own worst nightmare, which is, when they felt like maybe we weren't being as honest as we could, they would find ways around us, right? These shadow IT systems or whatever, and then they'd run off, and hey, all of a sudden we're buying, either buying Tableau or different products, and then we have all these pretty large shadow IT systems. So one of the things that I really think is important, and particularly when we talk about data governance, is communication, increasing visibility and transparency. Because the truth is that when I started, most people didn't have an appreciation for what it meant to build a data warehouse or write reports. But now most people are trained in that space in some way, shape, or form. So you can have these conversations with them. So one of the main things that is your responsibility for anything, but in particular data governance, is communication, communication, communication. And the more that you do that, the higher your credibility will be.
I think that's a great point, and I don't know if I have much to add to that. Let's go to sort of the next question. Which also the same person by Nico, which is, does a business see data governance as disruption or overhead cost of doing business? So I think that's a constant question, right, Laura? I mean, I see this all the time, where there's a question of, well, is it a cost or is it a benefit? What value that we're generating out of this governance practice? What have you seen as sort of ways to sort of address that in your practice?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I had this conversation just a couple of weeks ago with an executive, like, well, can you create an ROI with governance? No, don't ask me to. But if you're going to spend a couple $1 million on your data warehouse so you can put dashboards on top of it, do you really want it to be the Wild West? I don't think you do, So it's very difficult to tie a specific dollar amount to these kind of programs. But it is a little bit of the cost of doing business. If you see data as an asset, then there's got to be some governance function that supports that. But one of the things I will say is, if we manage data governance the way we used to in the late 90s, which is essentially you had a mechanism for managing every part of the data warehouse. So, you had a team that was specific for each schema. The schemas were simple back then, right? So you'd need a team that's giant, like you couldn't even possibly scale if you tried. So I think we can do this, and it doesn't have to be a giant cost, and it shouldn't be disruptive necessarily, but we should disrupt how we have historically done it. But it is the cost of doing business when you talk about creating any kind of data asset.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that's what we see as well. That while there's benefits that can be measured, right? I think Laura's, I agree with you 100%. You can't. There's just not an ROI number you can generate. If you can show that you're driving increased usage, if you can show baseline some of those engagement numbers. There's various ways to baseline data literacy, which governance definitely supports as well. And then I think it's all about making sure that you can sort of track against those key internal KPIs that shows that in fact the investment is paying off, albeit not in a dollars and cents way, but in a way that is that's tangible to the organization. And then of course there is that dental hygiene aspect to it, right?
Yes.
What's the cost of losing a tooth? It's not a dollar amount. You brush your teeth because you don't want to lose any, right? So I think that's the way it is. What do you think about the other question while advising clients? What's the minimum viable component of a data governance program?
Clarity and communication. Like if you want to strip it down to the basics, get really clear about what data governance means to your organization. Like, throw out a whole bunch of crap, right? Because most of it isn't going to help you. And that's true with almost anything that you want to do. But if you're really trying to get this moving forward, get laser focused on what data governance means to you. Maybe it's not the 4 categories I outlined, but be really clear about that and then communicate the heck out of that thing. Mm-hmm. And, we're not great communicators in general as data people. I'm terrible at it, to be honest with you. But, you just kind of got to bang that drum, and you just do it in a million ways to Sunday. But clarity and communication are the 2 things that really are important.
And what are your thoughts about, the question here that Melissa asked about your what suggestions would you have about bringing governance to self-service BI?
Boy, I have so many opinions about self-service. Go whole other webinar. And I feel like sometimes self-service is a little bit of a misnomer. And I think really the question was, gosh, we've done this and now it feels like it's been like you let the cat out of the bag and now you can't get the cat back in the bag. And there are ways and different ways to improve it and do it. So, the interesting thing about it is of course we talk about increasing usage because that's really important, because as you increase usage, you can start to show some value to it. And maybe I can't give you a hard ROI, but you definitely should be able to see some improvements, right? But there's also a potential, particularly when you start talking about self-service BI, where people just run amok. So there's a couple of things. First and foremost, if you're letting people just kind of create their own, and I'm just going to like dashboards or reports, and I'm using air quotes for those that are just listening, you can come up with specific protocols for how those things are published out broadly. And that's much more of like a portfolio governance capability than it is a data governance capability. But the other thing is, if you find yourself in a situation where from a self-service BI perspective, people are doing crazy things and you don't know how to pull that back, then that's actually an opportunity for data literacy. I don't think that's necessarily an opportunity for data governance, but to start to help your broad, very excited organization that's kind of run amok, to give them a little bit of a broader perspective of how to execute on some of those things and not create more harm than good, I guess.
I think those are really good points, and the only thing I would add to that would be what I've seen is that unique to me. I think it has to become an on-ramp between that true sort of a little bit of a Wild West self-service world, which will happen in every organization no matter what you do, because people are gonna get Tableau and they're gonna start building things, and they're gonna you can't keep people, Power BI or whatever you have, you can't keep people from building things, but there needs to be kind of a process and a flow that says, okay, well, that's content and it's out there, and here's the way, like you said, Laura, there should be a way to consume that, but it should be consumed in a way that's very distinct and different from the way that governed content is, where it has been certified, where the lineage is well understood, where somebody's verified that the data quality is there, and so forth. So having a workflow and a process where they can take that self-service content and promote it to that next level, I think is a way to kind of have both of those worlds coexist without too much friction.
Yeah.
And there's a question here, what is the difference between data governance and BI or analytics governance? So I'll start with that and see what you think, Laura, on your side. I mean, from my perspective, if data governance is classically about the data, but if you stop at the data, then you've sort of only gone halfway to actually achieving anything, because in reality, 99% of your organization is not consuming the data raw. They're consuming the data through some kind of analytic, visualization, a BI tool, something in front of it. And that tool invariably is adding something, whether those be rules or making decisions about how data is presented or any of the above. So BI governance is really, to me, an umbrella that covers really everything, which data governance is a part of it. It's the way at least I think of it. But how do you think of it, Laura?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it. I really do. There's, most organizations conflate governance functions. And this is one of why I keep sort of harping on that, get very clear about what you mean by data governance. But I often will see organizations conflate portfolio governance with data governance with, other kinds of information governance and blah, 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 blah. And so part of it is you have to create very distinct, clear definitions of what each of those things are for your organization, and then just kind of keep hitting that drum. But I like the way that you talked about it.
Okay. Well, Vinay asks, where does the data classification fit in data governance framework, and how does it work? So do you have any thoughts about data classification?
I do. It's one of the primary tools that I use. And it is a great communication tool for you to use with your privacy, security, risk, and compliance team, because it's an area that they sort of intuitively understand, although they may have not seen it in that space before. So I would use it like that. And I do tend to use them very early on as we've already talked about creating that happy alliance. It's one of the first documents that I bring up. So as they are writing their policies and procedures, that is a document you can execute against when you're thinking about protecting the asset in the data warehouse. So now we start to understand how we lock things down, what rules should be applied, that kind of a thing. So to me, it is the tool that you use when you're having those conversations with your privacy, security, risk, and compliance teams. And that's how you start to think about implementing that security in your back end.
And what do you think about, this is a great question that was around, how do you manage the boiling the ocean? Because I think we see that all the time, right? These governance initiatives that try to do everything and they never accomplish anything, right? Yeah. So do you have any pragmatic sort of advice around how to really take an incremental approach that's going to get results?
Yeah. So that's really interesting. And one of the things I say to people all the time is, like, oh, how do you boil the ocean? 1 cup at a time. Okay. So you boil 1 cup at a time. And then how do you keep that cup warm while you go off and get another cup? Like, yeah. Can we just stop using that analogy, please? But yeah. It's the reality is, right, as soon as you do this, there's a ton of pressure and people have these expectations around governance. One of the first things I talk about is please don't buy any pieces of software. And here's why. It's not that I don't think they're important, but when you do it first, or if that's the thing that you go to, and that includes data classification, or not data classification, data catalogs, it includes any data quality tools, it includes anything that you would do in the space, metadata, tools. If you do that first, then you immediately are going to be asked to do an ROI, right? Like prove that the money we just spent is safe with us, right? And you're immediately on back of your heels, because we already talked about the fact that it's exceedingly difficult. Like, I know you can try to do a soft ROI, but I've been, my butt's been handed to me by more than one CFO as I've tried to have that conversation with them. So if you avoid the whole idea of, building that ROI right off the gate by not buying software right away, I think that's probably your safest thing in terms of these giant expectations, right? So get very, very clear about what you're doing, right? And then just kind of keep swimming, as we use the ocean analogy, right? And keep delivering iterative things. And then once you get a little bit of traction, then you can start to look at buying things. But if you can avoid buying things, then I do think that you maintain the expectations of the organization are a little bit lower. They don't expect to get their money back right away. But there's a lot there. So.
It's also true, I think, exactly what you said, that there's a lot of value to starting and to getting some of that process understanding. You naturally iterate over your goals. So, the mistake, like you said, of trying to get tools before you really have that working strategy and having something that is going to execute, is that you might get the wrong tools, or you might get things that don't fit together, or so you've got the cart before the horse. So I think that's really good advice. You kind of want to know where you're heading and then figure out what are the things I need to put together to make that happen.
You're gonna be a lot more successful.
Okay. Let's see, we've got so many questions in so little time here. So let's see if there's, do you see anything on the list here that you want to pick up next?
There are a lot of questions. Holy buckets. Will I get a chance maybe to answer these? I would be happy to answer these offline as we run out.
That's what we'll do. So, well, one more. Why don't you pick one that you want to answer, and then what we'll do is we'll send you the full list afterwards, and you can just answer.
Okay. Well, that's all right. I'll just take the one off the top here. If we lack top-down support, are we dead in the water? I think a lot of people question that. And how do we know if leadership is actually enabling a pervasive approach to governance? And what does that look like? So, if we lack top-down support, are we dead in the water? Well, you're not dead, but I sure hope you have more than a pool noodle. The fact of the matter is you're going to need support. And, I've talked a lot about executive support over the years. And I used to say, oh, you got to have more than one executive, because we've all been, that situation where your executive sponsor leaves the organization. But the fact of the matter is, in order to make data governance pervasive, you're going to have some executive support. That's just how that works. But the reality is if you don't have the bottom up support, you won't get very far either, right? So you kind of have to have both. And I do think, and talk about this a little bit in the book, is that you have to flip the script a little bit on that top-down support. We used to give so much like checkbox activity to executives that would just accidentally show up to our committee meetings once in a while, be like, oh, they have, they're supporting data governance. Half the time they weren't, they couldn't articulate what it meant. They certainly weren't understanding what they were prioritizing, but they happen to have that open slot for one time out of 6 months. So therefore I call them my data governance steward or my data governance sponsor. And so we have to flip the script and make them a little bit more accountable for some of the work, but we're not making them accountable for doing the work, right? We have to make them accountable for driving some of that work. So I think that's really what we're looking for here when we talk about executive support that will help you make it more pervasive. So I hope that answers the question about what that looks like too. So,
thank you, Laura. And yeah, and I want to thank you with that. I want to thank you so much. It's been delightful to have you join us in the webinar. I think you've got such a wonderful perspective on things and fresh take. And I think I know everyone on this enjoyed. We will send a recording out to everyone. And also whoever the lucky winner is will receive your book. And with that, thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.